Hello, Mr. Hardy here, and in this video I would like to teach you about the poem There's a Certain Slant of Light by Emily Dickinson. So we'll start by reading the poem, we'll then go through it stanza by stanza to check our understanding. I'll then identify the poem's key message and any areas where we can explore conflict. I'll then pick out some key linguistic, structural and poetic techniques that Dickinson makes use of that you may want to annotate on your own copy of the poem. And finally, I'll leave you with an exam-style question you can answer at the end of the video to solidify your knowledge of this poem. So, our poet is Emily Dickinson. She was an American poet. She was born in 1830 and she died in 1886. She was considered an isolated and eccentric woman. So by isolated, I mean she never married. She stayed at home most of the time. You might consider her a hermit. She communicated with her friends mainly through letters and not meeting them face to face. And this is quite unusual, and some people call it eccentric. And couple this with the fact that she used to always wear like white dresses when she did leave her house and walk around. She was considered quite an unusual woman for her time. In her lifetime, she wrote 1,800 poems. However, only 10 were published when she was alive. The rest were published posthumously by her friends, who actually edited her poems quite a bit, which changed maybe the original style and format of her poems. And speaking of her poetic style, she's very, very unique. Her poems are heavily punctuated. They're quite short, they're quite fragmented. They're also quite profound, and they really make you think about deep topics. Emily Dickinson really loved the topic of life and death, and this comes across in a lot of her poems. So, let's get stuck into it. There's a Certain Slant of Light by Emily Dickinson. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it, any, 'tis the seal despair, an imperial infliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. And there you have it, a really short 4-stanza poem. So what is happening? Now with most poems, people interpret them differently. Poems are great because they are open to interpretation and you can take your own personal meaning from each poem. With Dickinson's poem, and with this one in particular, it is really subjective. That means two different people reading the same poem could come up with two completely different interpretations of what's going on. So in this video, be aware that this is just my interpretation of what's going on, and it may be different from yours or other people's. So in stanza 1, there is a persona. The main character of the poem sees a slant of light, so maybe the light is filtering between trees or through a window or something, and this slant of light makes the persona think of death, and the thought of death they find quite oppressive and depressing. In stanza 2, the persona muses. They think about this feeling of death, and they acknowledge that it might be God-sent, it's invisible, it's profound, it's made them stop what they were doing in their day and think about death. In stanza 3, the persona expresses that this feeling, this thinking about death, is a bit like the apocalypse, the biblical end of the world. And we get some allusions to the Bible here. And then in stanza 4, the final stanza, the light and the feelings and contemplations of death are so powerful that even nature pays attention. And we revisit one of Dickinson's favourite themes, death, at the very end of the poem. So what is the poem's message? Now bearing in mind I said people interpret it differently, I think the poem's message is quite vague and open. So I would say that There's a Certain Slant of Light by Dickinson is a poem that contemplates, thinks about death, and deals with the feelings related to death. I don't dare to go any deeper or any more specific because it is quite an open and purposely ambiguous poem, and readers can make their own interpretations based off that. So where do we find conflict in this poem? Well, clearly it's not a war poem. There's no physical death or guns or swords or anything of the sort. Instead, I think it's internal conflict. The persona is clearly battling thoughts about death and feelings about death, and both thoughts and feelings happen inside a person's body, inside their mind and heart. There's also conflict in the idea of life versus death. So Dickinson and her persona are alive at the time of writing, but yet they're contemplating an inevitable end, death. These two are obviously in conflict. You can't be alive and dead at the same time. And we get happiness and sadness in conflict. I assume Dickens and her persona want to be happy in life, but seeing this slant of light has got them thinking about death. It's got them feeling quite oppressed and depressed, and ultimately feeling quite sad, which again contrasts the desire for happiness. Okay, despite it being a short poem, Dickinson employs a wide range of techniques. Linguistically, she uses metaphor, allusion, specifically biblical allusion, oxymoron, alliteration, simile, hyperbole, and personification. Structurally, the poem is set out in 4 stanzas, and each stanza has 4 lines, and we can call this a quatrain. There is a syllabic structure. Lines 2 and 4 from each stanza have 5 syllables, whereas lines 1 and 3 have more, usually around 7 syllables. And there is a rhyme scheme, A, B, C, B, so that means lines 2 and 4 rhyme. And overall, this creates the effect of a tight structure, which I think mimics the tight, controlling, oppressive feeling that thoughts of death can have on people, such as the persona in the poem. And poetically speaking, Dickinson uses a wide range of punctuation, and this contributes to a large amount of caesura and end stopping in her poetry. We also get imagery. All good poets try to paint images in the reader's mind, and we get a little bit of enjambment as well. So let's go through it stanza by stanza and look at these techniques in action. First thing to notice is that rhyme scheme. Line 2, afternoons, rhymes with line 4, tunes. And if you want to count out the syllables, you'll identify that winter afternoons is 5 syllables, of cathedral tunes is 5 syllables as well. So we have that pattern. There's a certain slant of light. The slant of light is a metaphor for death. So it's comparing this physical light that is filtering in between trees or windows or something to the thought, the idea of being dead or of death itself. So the light here is a metaphor for death. Winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. I just want to look at the verb oppresses. If you oppress someone, I immediately think of slavery and leaving someone trapped with no other options. This is what death does to the persona in this poem. They can't escape the thought of it. They're completely surrounded and oppressed by the thought of death. Like the heft of cathedral tunes is a simile. Heft means like weightiness, heaviness. So here Dickinson is comparing the thought of death to the heaviness of cathedral tunes. Now if you ever go to a cathedral music tends to be played on organs, and a big organ in a cathedral can sound loud, overpowering, intimidating, overwhelming. And using the simile to compare the cathedral tunes, cathedral music, to this feeling of death shows how thinking about death is overwhelming, overpowering and intimidating the persona of this poem. I just want to draw your attention to the use of punctuation. So there's commas and there's dashes here. And if they come at the end of the line, we call that end stopping. And I believe Dickinson does this to really slow down the pace of the poem and make you focus on each line. Each line has an image or an idea that she wants you to dwell upon. When we get the punctuation in the middle of the line, we call that caesura, like we have in line 3 after oppressors. And I believe that comma is there to make us stop and focus on the verb oppresses before we stop and focus and deal with the simile comparing thoughts of death to cathedral music. Now we get a bit of enjambment, like the heft of cathedral tunes. In theory that should all be one line because it's one idea, but by splitting it over 2 lines, the technique is enjambment, and it kind of speeds up the poem a little bit. And this is purely my own interpretation, but I think the combination of the caesura and the end stopping, which slows the poem down and creates quite a disjointed effect, alongside a little bit of enjambment that speeds it up, creates quite a confusing effect, and which I think reflects the fact that thoughts of death confuse the persona. I think you could even also argue that this maybe even mimics cathedral music itself, where it can be at times quite slow and disjointed, and at times quite fast and overwhelming. In stanza 2, we have the same rhyme scheme, we have the same sort of syllabic structure, so that is continuous throughout. We start with an alliteration, heavenly hurt. The repetition of the H sound really draws our attention to this phrase. This phrase is also an oxymoron. An oxymoron is when you put 2 opposite ideas next to each other. So when you think of heaven, most people think of something good, and in the Bible it says in heaven there is no hurt or death or disease or suffering, whereas immediately after the word heavenly, which we think of good, we have the word hurt, which we immediately think of as bad. We think of suffering and death and disease, etc. So by putting 2 opposite ideas together, we can call that oxymoron. And the caesura, the comma after it, really makes us stop and contemplate this alliterative oxymoron. According to Dickinson and her persona, the thoughts of death come from heaven. So God has sent these thoughts of death to sort of afflict mortal people, to make people suffer. Whilst contemplating these thoughts of death, the persona reveals we can find no scar. So there is no physical wound, there is no cut or bruise. Instead, it's like an internal bleeding, an internal bruising. She thinks about death so much that internally she is scarred by it. I've underlined the pronouns us and we because they're quite inclusive, and I think this shows Dickinson is trying to universalise the thought of death. We know as humans we are all going to die one day. None of us are immortal, so we all at some point in our lives contemplate death, and we all have this feeling of maybe oppression and depression as a result. So this poem is quite universal. Line 3, internal difference. I've underlined internal because I think that links back with conflict. This is clearly a poem of internal conflict as opposed to external warfare and conflict, where the meanings are. I just want to draw your attention again to all the punctuation used. Again, it's mainly commas and dashes. If it's at the end, it's an end stop. If it's in the middle, it's a caesura. And it creates this sort of stop-starty rhythm where you, as a reader, stop and contemplate each line very carefully because there's no flow to move on to the next line. In stanza 3, none may teach it any. No one can teach you about death and feelings about death. You just have to experience it. And again, the caesura and end stopping surrounding any breaks up the flow or rhythm of the poem. It's here in stanza 3 that we get biblical allusion. Allusion is when you refer to something else, and in this stanza, Dickinson refers to the Bible. "'Tis the seal despair." In the last book of the Bible, in the New Testament, it's called Revelation, and the disciple John, who was Jesus' most beloved disciple, has been exiled to the Greek island of Patmos, and there he has received revelation, so like visions of the apocalypse, of the end of the earth. And part of his vision was there were 7 seals on a scroll. A wax or clay seal keeps the scroll tight, and only a person with the correct authority can break open the seals. But what happens is when these 7 seals were broken, different afflictions were released from the scroll and affected the earth. The first 4 seals held the horsemen of the apocalypse. The other seals held things like earthquakes and suffering and natural disasters, etc. So breaking these seals caused suffering on earth. And here Dickinson is using a biblical allusion to show how thinking about death and feelings about death are suffering on earth. And as we learn in the previous stanza, they are a heavenly hurt. They come from God in heaven. So God has broken the seals of despair and has unleashed apocalyptic pain and hurt on this persona by showing her a slant of light, which makes them think about death. In line 3, we get an imperial affliction. If something is imperial, it is like a leader. So like we used to have Imperial Japan, and the emperor was the leader of the imperial army. So the imperial leader of the universe, the number one most powerful thing in the universe, is God. So this is an imperial affliction. God has given this affliction of death. Now remember the conflict between life and death. If you believe that God created the world and God created humanity, then God created life. God gave humans life. But then he also gave this affliction, which is the thought of death. Now that's clearly in conflict. Surely if God wants us to live happily, he should just create life and not even create death, or not allow humans to consider thinking about death. But by doing this, there is a clear conflict here. And this is clearly a hyperbole. A hyperbole is a type of exaggeration that goes beyond belief. So by calling the thought of death and the feelings of death a God-sent affliction, like an apocalyptic event, Dickinson is clearly exaggerating the feelings this persona has when they've looked upon the slant of light. And finally, sent us off the air. I just want to let you know that I'm not making typing mistakes when I put any and air in capitals. Dickinson doesn't seem to follow the standard grammatical rules of capital letters and full stops. Instead, she tends to put capitals on words that she wants you to really focus on and contemplate. So seal despair is capitalised, any air is capitalised. Have a reread of the poem and maybe identify all the words that have capital letters used incorrectly, and then you might be able to identify that they are quite important concepts in the poem, maybe quotable words and phrases that you could use in your answer, and unpick what Dickinson means by them in relation to conflict and death. And finally, we come on to stanza 4, and this is incredibly vague. So again, this is a reminder, this is just my interpretation. People might have different interpretations to me. When it comes, the landscape listens. It is purposely vague, that's why I've underlined it. What is the it? Is the it the light? Is the it death? I think it's both, because remember they're metaphorically linked. So when death and the thought of death comes, the landscape listens. There's a bit of alliteration there, LL, landscape listens. There's also personification. The landscape, the mountains, the trees, the fields, the lakes, they can't listen, they don't have ears. Whereas humans can listen, we do have ears, so that is personification. I think the personification is reinforced by the capitalising of landscape. It almost is trying to turn it into a proper noun, as if it were a person, as opposed to a common noun. Shadows also hold their breath. Again, this is personification. Shadows have no lung capacity, they have no breath to hold, whereas humans do. So by giving the ability to hold breath to a shadow, we are personifying the shadow. And once again, the shadow is capitalised to try and give it a proper noun quality instead of a common noun. So basically, death and the thought of death and the emotion of death are so big and significant that even nature, Mother Nature, the landscape, the shadows stop and listen and think and contemplate death. When it goes, again, what is the it? Is it death? Is it the light? Is it actual death? Is it thoughts about death? Is it emotions linked to death? It's really vague here. Dickinson is purposely ambiguous. 'Tis like the distance on the look of death. Now this is a simile, we know it is because of the word like, and it's comparing it, death, the thought of death, the emotions of death, the slant of light, to the distance on the look of death. Now, I've thought about this, and in my opinion, on the look of death, Dickinson could be referring to the look in the eyes of a dead person. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a dead person, and if you, for whatever reason, have opened their eyelid, but their eyes tend to be glazed over, maybe a bit milky, and they tend to be looking off into the distance. There's no focus. Now, a human who's alive, when they have a similar kind of look, is normally when they're stunned or shocked. If you've had a very shocking event happen to you, for example, you might have been in a car crash, if you look at people after a shocking event, they look in the distance, their eyes are glazed over, a bit like a dead person. So I think this simile is saying that when death, or the thoughts of death, or the emotions of death go away, having contemplated death, it leaves the persona and Dickinson, and maybe even the reader, as if they were in a state of death, looking into the distance, not being focused, being glazed over, being shocked and stunned. That's just my interpretation. Again, this poem is intentionally ambiguous, and Dickinson's poetry is very subjective. It can be interpreted in different ways by different people. This is just my interpretation. Again, we get end stopping through our dashes, and we get some caesura through the commas and the dashes as well. We have that bit of enjambment at the end in the simile, "'tis like the distance on the look of death." But what I do want to point out is that Dickinson ends with the punctuation of a dash, and dashes are normally used to join two clauses, which implies to me there should be another clause, another stanza, something else. And my personal interpretation, based on the evidence of the biblical allusion, I reckon maybe Dickinson is suggesting that there is something beyond death. There might be life beyond death, and that's implied by the dash, because the poem hasn't fully ended. There is potential for another clause. But again, that is purely my own interpretation. I just made a little note at the bottom that this tight structure, these 4 stanzas, 4 lines, syllabic structure, rhyme control, fragmented sentences due to the syntax, all of this tight structure, I think, reflects the oppressive feeling that death has on Dickinson and the persona. It almost traps them, surrounds them, constricts them, tightens in on them. Okay, I think you can agree with me that it's quite a tricky poem that is open to many interpretations. If you liked my interpretations and my analysis and explanation, please make notes from it on a physical copy of the poem. I think that's a really great way to aid your revision. And if you want to practice answering an exam-style question, you might want to answer this one. How does Dickinson explore internal conflict in There's a Certain Slant of Light? You may want to start off by explaining the message of the poem and the concept and theme of death, and the internal conflict that comes about from that. You can then spend a paragraph looking at some of the language used, maybe the metaphors or the oxymoron. You can move on to the tight structure and how that reflects the tightening feeling of death. Maybe you want to pick up some poetic structures. I would definitely look at the caesura and the end stopping and her use of punctuation. That's very unique to Dickinson. And then you can come to any conclusions you have about internal conflict in the poem There's a Certain Slant of Light by Emily Dickinson. Well, if you like this video and you think it helped you with your OCR GCSE poetry revision, please give it a like. Please subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on any poetry explanation videos. And please leave a comment if you have a different interpretation to the poem than I do, which I'm sure you do, and I'm sure yours is very valid as well. So thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.